Have any public comment? For the record. Okay. Do we have any public comments of a general nature? Any public comments related to the one single agenda item? Nope. Okay. Take it away, sir.
We have our equipment back up and down, so whenever you do have questions and commentary, just everything's working here. So, all right, I'm gonna try to angle this so I can brief to the slides here. But good evening, members of the board, staff, citizen. Everything that I've ever had in terms of experience in local government, when you're preparing a next year's fiscal year planning cycle, you want to basically kind of look in retrospect of your past prior years worth of activities. So normally a state of the township is a true state of the township. It's like an alignment of, we've collected all the information on our progression, on our comprehensive plan. We have somehow aligned that with kind of that intermediary strategic kind of goal benchmarking that we do in terms of how we're measuring ourselves against those successes. And then you take that and then you align that with your next year's spending plan in terms of general fund, as well as your 5-year planning for capital funding improvements. So that is generally the case for a state of this township. And so when I first got here, when we started doing all of this upturning on all the information, and I started getting a lot of questions, not just from members of the board, staff, and residents coming up to me, it seemed pretty clear that there needed to be kind of some explaining of some of the common misconceptions about what us as a township, where we're really at this moment in time in terms of FY23 and some of the context leading up to it, and how that prepares us to face, we'll call them the next wave of challenges in front of us for the next 5, 10, 20, so on years. So that's what I really prepared this for, was getting a true assessment, kind of putting on my consultant hat here, kind of taking off any sort of biased lens and saying, if I were to just come in as someone who's just looking at an organization, what are they actually prepared for? What are their weaknesses? So kind of like a SWOT-esque analysis. And that's kind of what we looked at the end of this. And then building a lot of, we'll call them the using public information, mostly our sourced information sources, to kind of build kind of everything in terms of regional context and kind of put the whole pieces of the puzzle all together. And so hopefully that illustrates what we're about to go through here. So I'll go ahead and just kind of walk through the actual, is it actually going to click here? Step 1, make sure your clicker works. And kind of the areas we're going to cover today. So overview of the township, just kind of some history, some character type stuff. These are pulled from our own sources. Kind of, to me, your history of the township kind of begets kind of where you are in terms of actual land usage and how your township is constructed. So that's very useful information. Some growth and demographics, kind of understanding of our population, housing, and income. Those are the primary factors that kind of set your realistic tax base in order to be able to produce revenues towards actually commissioning revenue towards operational expenses and capital expenses. So those are very important for us to know. Speaking of revenues, going over our different major sources of revenue, as well as some benchmarks. It's always very helpful when you understand that this is just us in a silo, but if we pull together kind of other like-sized and benchmark townships, not necessarily our immediate neighbors, because we kind of differentiate, but when you look at the entire market of Chester County, all of them have similar square mileage population, we'll call them housing units as well. That kind of lets us know that, okay, we are what we are and they are what they are. And that's kind of what's able to provide that extra information of, are we doing well? Are we below board? Are we above board? In terms of expenditures, really, it's just kind of going over the primary look at our general fund. I wanted to go a little bit more into capital, but we've kind of had like a little bit of a varied history. So it's very difficult to pin down an exact track of where we've been looking at for the long term. So I wanted to concentrate mostly on general fund. And then just in terms of what your kind of we'll call them your largest level liabilities are in terms of ongoing expenditures for us, obviously public safety, as we all know, and then just looking at our net cash position, both current and then prior sewer sale to kind of pull together like where we were, where we kind of combined everything and where we are going forward. So when we talk about services, I like to connect characteristics to services. So this one will kind of connect into kind of where we are, or excuse me, what we are. And then this kind of dictates what we are in terms of our staffing levels, our departments, footprints, and what we should be prioritizing in terms of making sure that we have the right people on hand to mirror the service types that our residents are, I guess, expecting. And then that begets the next one, which is organizational health. What makes a healthy organization from a local government perspective, kind of tackling some of the issues and recommendations in terms of where we actually need to be in terms of FTE count and the required, we'll call it expenditure levels in order to achieve those FTE counts. And then last but not least, our strategy going forward, kind of what the next 5 years really entail. So right now, I think we're at the 2018 comp plan. So, we're right at that 5-year mark halfway. The next 5 years will get us to the end of that kind of 10-year window when your comp plan really needs to be kind of reassessed for that next cycle, we'll call it. So this is kind of like the roadmap to get the rest of the way towards when we start actually readdressing our future-facing comprehensive plan. All right, so quickly kind of going over the township here. So we have a lot of inputs. We are a very disparate level of uses in the township. We have a kind of like a little bit of everything. Our portfolio is very vast when it comes to land use in terms of, we have our rural, our semi-rural, our suburban, our commercial, our industrial, our residential. We have a lot of different use types there. We have historical, we have modern, if you had to kind of put together kind of one batch for a meal, we're a very weird set of ingredients when you put it all together. Some more communities have the benefit of being a more cohesive kind of understanding. We don't have that luxury because of everything that we have here, but it does make us unique in that we have a lot of different abilities to address certain areas of need. So that's actually our kind of like our strengths and the weaknesses kind of combined there. But one thing that's not actually there is a vision and mission statement driving the actual guidance towards what we want to achieve as a township. So normally on any kind of a governmental website or just kind of in terms of the charter, anything, there's some sort of like, we are this as a community. And then you always know underlying everything kind of rolls up to that guiding vision and mission statement. So in lieu of having one, what I tried to do was kind of slap one together that might be the most closest from my understanding of what a mission statement would entail. But for me, that's kind of a mixture of some historic information. So this is from our actual once upon a time in New Garden Township history, where it kind of depicts us as this is kind of like very rural, picturesque, forested, wooded area. And then what our comprehensive plan, which is kind of like that, but with development kind of on top of it. So that's kind of where we are as a community. So that would be an interesting exercise to possibly go through, would be kind of like a public driven process towards finalizing some sort of mission vision statement. Then we then kind of start aligning strategic goals towards an execution of our comprehensive plan. So what does this mean? Kind of what I just said. We lack a defining guidance overall. It's not there, but it's one where we have all the makings to determine that. It just needs to be set forth. So a little bit of what we are: historic, rural, natural, scenic. These are kind of the defining characteristics, as I would kind of say, just based off of what I've seen thus far. We have our agri-industrial, and I kind of put those together is because we have scale production of mushrooms in a very industrial type fashion. So that is definitely a gigantic presence, especially on the western central side of our township. We are suburban, family oriented, and active. We have those kind of modern amenities, outdoor amenities that a lot of communities look to kind of build as, you've got all the infrastructure in. Now people want open space. They want recreational activities. We have a good sizable amount of that, plus the airport down there in the corner, which is a kind of one-off type amenity, but it's definitely something that provides a tremendous amount of value to the township. And then we're safe. We have very strong core public safety services here, and we're very beneficial for that. I believe I bring it up later on in the brief, but for the most part, kind of what makes a local community thrive is kind of a Venn diagram usually, and that's a kind of a mixture of safety, your public safety apparatus, your schools function. You want to make sure you have a really good school system to attract people to come to your community. And then you want jobs, you want economic opportunities, you want to have ability to actually kind of stay in like a one-stop shop for your community as much as possible. So this begets land use. So how we have grown thus far is, in theory, prior to this, kind of all of our defining characteristics and everything put together, but your land use is how you actually did it and what those percentages entail. So if in terms of a mixture of different types of land use, I actually was able to pull this from the Chester County parcel files from their GIS, which helped kind of provide some understandings of where we actually are in terms of total land use, and then what that land value is actually doing us in terms of base values. So a little bit of explaining here, they actually separate apartments. So this is what the higher level code is. And then there are subline codes within these land use codes. So think of it like you have R, but then you'll have like R10, R20, R30, 40, different types of residential types. Same thing. But then you'll have R40 and R90, which are different types of apartments. Those R codes will be under apartment, if that makes sense. Here also in terms of commercial, it seems like it's commercial like you would think of just large scale, like, you know, like our cold storage facilities and some of the retail. But commercial also includes the F40 designation, which is mushroom farming and all associated industries here, which is why our commercial presence and our usage there has a pretty sizable value next to it, rather than farming, which has a pretty small value next to it, if that makes sense. But to me, the biggest takeaway from this entire slide is our residential and our commercial make up pretty much all of our township right now. You know, we're very leveraged against being a commercial, mostly mushroom farming community and residential. I know I'm breaking a lot of news, for we grow mushrooms here and we have houses, but that's what our land use tells us. The big takeaway for me is residential produces 17% above, and our commercial actually produces 10% less. So we actually don't get a considerable amount of positive value out of our current commercial footprint. And that's one thing where, if at the minimum, you always want to have net neutral land use, never really net negative, but if it has been net negative, you want it to be around the margins, but not, you know, in double figures for that considerable amount of size of your community. And we'll show some values here associated with it, but that was kind of highlighting me of, okay, you know, we have a sizable value in terms of wanting to allow commercial industries, sizably mushroom farms here, but just knowing that that's coming at the behest of land valuations and ultimately, in this case, revenue for cost for services, especially if your cost for services is driving up the cost of having to, you know, service roads with large level CDL type trucks kind of moving on them all the time. Anything related to that type of industry, it creates a burden, not a burden per se, but it definitely stresses our public services. So land use and real estate tax, I said I would provide a quick follow-up on that one. So from a residential standpoint, you know, our base assessments on here, we're about 826 million and change in terms of our total underlying assessments, and of which 73.6 of that is our residential footprint on it. So that's kind of showing what we saw on the last slide here. But in terms of exact real estate millage, because our mill being kind of at the lowest and one of the lowest in Chester County in terms of certain jurisdictions of our size, only yields about $1.1 million in total revenue. In comparison, you know, our mushroom and / commercial community is about 143 million, but in the acreage, but it only produces about 247,000. So when we talk about kind of what it's doing for the microeconomy, they might do a lot for the larger level Pennsylvania regional macroeconomy, but in terms of local footprint, you know, we don't necessarily get a ton of revenue covering these types of costs. And we'll also brief EIT, which is another sizable revenue, but in terms of what's actually driving revenues here in the township that we able to use to do all of our public safety, our roads, all of our kind of community development type services, everything that we're going to be doing in terms of like commercial inspections, everything through our fire code. You know, you want to make sure that at least your primary reasons for having said services are at least covering your costs, and that's not necessarily the case. So the takeaway for the most part is just, you know, we didn't have beyond that initial buildup scaled appetite for additional residential developments in the township. The net impact from that has been, and we'll go over some additional demographics here in a bit, but kind of like a flat to declining population base here in the township. That's what our demographics currently show us. And then as you have competing priorities in terms of space, like how much are you occupying current land use, and then you put on top of that the actual open space program, which can eat into those commercial land acreages or those farming land acreages. What the net impact of that is in terms of the overall effect is it converts those taxable properties into non-taxable. So you actually depress your base accordingly. So even though you might incur some growth here and there, if you're doing that at the same time, it actually makes it probably right around a net zero, maybe a little bit above or below. So every time someone sees a new development, but we're also having the corresponding open space program, it kind of ends up not really doing much in the aggregate. And obviously for commercial tax, kind of already laid forward of what that is in terms of a negative assessment value differential. So this is just another one about the open space. So right now, for people that don't understand or have an awareness, so we have obviously from 2005 an earmark of about 0.125% on top of our earned income tax. So we're about 1.125. And what that actually equates to is about 0.55 mils. So people who don't necessarily know what EIT percentages really yield, think of it just in terms of mils, it's a little over half a mil in terms of a tax on top of our earned income that yields right now based off of our income base about $450,000 a year. And that's just replenishable revenue, whether or not it is currently used for purchasing a property in that year or not. This is building up a fund balance for the open space fund for future purchases. And that's the amount that's coming in. And so to date, we have roughly about 15% of our township, or a little over 10,000 in the aggregate, and about based off of a prior brief that the open space review board members briefed about kind of an 8% glide path for additional land remaining in terms of what would be transitionable open space into that program. And this was the graphic that we put on that brief. So hopefully it's not new to the people at the board. But the one thing I wanted to highlight here is cost for community services. So one of the real reasons that we commissioned an open space was it was not only to preserve the aesthetic and the rural charm of the community, which is an intrinsic value of the residents at that time, but also it was briefed as it actually depresses cost for services because you're not developing it. So therefore you're not having to service that land area anymore. And in theory, that is true, to certain points true. So one thing that their slides incorporated was obviously the biggest impact is always going to be residential. And the biggest reason for this $13 comparatively, and this is for, if I remember correctly, it's for every dollar spent, it's above that. So it's like you're saving a ton if you're doing it here, but you're spending more if you're doing it there, is mostly because of schools. Schools have, residential development depending upon the type of unit that you're developing. School-age children, more kids go to school. You have a capital component to that. And so it definitely ramps up their component to it. In theory, if you have, we'll call them ownership of your full utility system, that's a big component of it. If you have a significant amount of impact on roads, your streets program gets impacted. If you have certain amenities or everything, just the volume goes up with residential. But that's not necessarily the case for all types. So in comparison, your industrial component, which for the most part, if you're thinking about in terms of jobs creator, this would be something that would be a smaller space, but a high amount of EIT type values that you would be getting in terms of just payroll tax for those types of companies. It's actually lower in terms of cost for community service than open space. That's something to know. Another one in terms of commercial, this was kind of a mixed bag because the pulse of the studied communities included a cross-section of communities all across Chester County. Some of them had kind of very Spartan commercial ones, and some of them had higher commercial ones. And then I kind of did a double take on it. And all the high ones had scaled commercial mushroom farming presences in their township. So a lot of our neighboring ones, it's funny, they didn't list New Garden Township. I imagine we would probably blown the metric up here a little bit, but those were down here in like the quarter to 50 cents. So that plus this number up, if you got rid of that entity, this would probably go down pretty significantly. So just kind of understanding what the numbers are telling you a little bit here. But that's kind of a good story that, yes, in terms of residential, 100%, but in terms of these types of things that produce extra value to the township, not so much. So I believe that it was probably briefed that open space compared to residential, but it was never really open space compared to commercial, open space compared to industrial, and that story was never really fully told. And I wanted to make sure that we understood that. So the takeaway here is right now, we're kind of over leveraged with over 30% of our land use kind of being this is mushroom farm and this is open space, kind of low real estate to mid EIT type stuff. So if you have like a quadrant box, we're kind of net 0 to negative in all 4 quadrants. And that's not where you want to be for a significant part of your land use. So it's always good to understand kind of what's going on in your township. So most of these were from sourced kind of census, from different comprehensive plans, from different types of open data, DVRPC, you name it. So I was able to get a good cross section based off of our population, our incomes, and our housing. So this is one in terms of just population growth. This is the DVPRC metric here. Give us the long haul. But as you can see, the growth of the township kind of occurring from 90s to 2000s. That was that mass urban sprawl moment when everyone left the cities kind of around the 90s. And they developed a lot of these kind of rural areas. But as you can see, right around here is when we commissioned a lot of our, like the 05, mid 2000s type time frame. I think that's probably when we started to abate residential growth in the township. And that's good for maybe a small period of time. But if you continue that trend, and we kind of actively did that for about 15 straight years where we're at today, you're going to start to ebb, you're going to crest a little bit. So you're either going to be a little flat for a while, but I can imagine as of the 2040 census at the current rate that we're at, this is likely to come back down. And there's other reasons that factor into that, but it was mostly just because how we grew and then how we kind of shut the door behind that growth. And then what that means in terms of long-term risks and mostly our long-term liabilities in terms of what that does to our tax base and our ability to perform services at the level where when it was like a rising tide versus an ebbing one. So just going back real quick, this isn't to say that this is an irreversible type trend, but it's one where it takes years and years of catch up to get that going. That is a momentum type function, and it's really tough to get the momentum back. I'll add that too. So there were really good open sources in terms of estimates. So instead of taking one or the other, I took them both, kind of averaged it out. So obviously the DVPRC was a 2050 forecast and the Kennett one was a 2040. This is the Kennett Township 2015 comp plan. It's the most like hyper regional one. So it has a lot of like very like within a 5 nautical miles surrounding the Kennett Township area, and included a lot of really good population dynamics kind of estimates and housing and all those sorts of we'll call them demographic information. But obviously their estimate being done in the 2015, so new to that previous growth, kind of had a little bit more of a keeping up with the Joneses type approach with our population counts. DVPRC was a little bit more conservative, so that was also good. One was a little bit more progressive, one was a little bit more conservative. And that gave us kind of an understanding that even though they had disparate census counts, the average estimate kind of where we would be today would be about 15,000. So that means that we're about 3,900 people shy of the average estimate counts for terms of population forecasts from these two sources. So that is where we would need to grow into in order to get that number by 2050. So to put that into perspective, based off of the Westchester University performed study on the potential White Clay Point at the time, that was forecast to add around 680, 780 new residents, which means we would have to develop 5.5 White Clay Point developments just to achieve that 3,900 number, if that makes sense. So I don't know where we could fit 5.5 White Clay Point developments. It's likely not to happen, but that would need to be achieved within the next 20 years just to get to that base average in terms of our population counts, if that makes sense.
I just wanted to interject real fast about
Sure.
population trends. I was looking at adjoining municipalities that also didn't really have any sort of major development. So like Kennett Township, London Grove Township, and they all had, maybe 4 or 5% increase, whereas we, dropped a little bit.
Yep.
I was wondering if you had looked into that, perhaps that was due to the previous 4 years of, I'm going to say, demonization of the Hispanic community and perhaps a refusal to engage in the census.
Yeah, I mean, I came from a highly percentage-based Latino community, so the count was a big proponent of our public communications type strategy. That same, we'll call it just line of questioning came up. Even if it's not a 100% like line by line, house by house direct count, the sophistication of their estimates are so exact that where you're at is actually where you're at. So they do not only like a direct 1-1-1-1, but it's actually like an algorithm type approach of it as well. They take kind of both, and your number is eerily close to your number. So I would say within degrees of confidence that that could have it happened. Yes, I don't have any information in terms of what was actually like reported on and what may have actually directly happened, but I would have a pretty good degree of confidence that our number is our number right now in terms of where we're at. And granted, that was the 2020, they had updated to that kind of 2022, but it's right around the same number. I think if it's not 11.3, it's roughly around like 11.6. But the big issue is not necessarily the exact number right there, but it's just the fact that this is not up here, which is the biggest issue. So another one to look at is in terms of population growth. It's just what is the general, wow, that was a weird way of saying it, general age of your population demographic. So we, if you're not wholly familiar with age population distributions, you want to have a nice little bell curve. And we obviously do not. So we have a little bit of a roller coaster ride here. And I would say aggregate with our median age increases means that we likely just have a skewed population more towards an older audience that is ever increasing in age. And that has actually not changed. That's stayed pretty consistent because this is as of 2020. So I think we're right around like 42.9, 43 years. But every single year over year, we've had roughly about a 3.75. It actually ranges some years like closer to 4 plus. But as of the next 2030 census count, we're likely going to have like a 48 median age, which, obviously you can't have the exact number showing what is depressing those values or increasing those values, but this band is actually keeping that average age down. So if we were to eliminate our young core audience, which is, you're not really thinking that in terms of like tax revenues and everything, in terms of production level value in your community, that means that our median age is probably likely higher for all of our homeowners and those who are actually having properties in terms of equity in the township, as well as our earned income audience as well. So this is kind of where we all shake out. So our 50+% community, this is off of these ISO bars over here. So right now our 0 to 19 audience, it's about a quarter, and then obviously more than that for our 50+ audience as well. And that's from the DVRPC numbers. And this is a 5-year moving average estimate here too. So this is pretty solid. A few years old, but DVRPC takes, I think, about a 1.5 year lag on their reporting metrics, but usually it's pretty close when they update it again. So that's another one too. In terms of our EIT, I think of it like, what is our non-EIT? That's kind of this group here and anybody kind of in retirement, because as everyone knows in Pennsylvania, retirement is not taxed, and that's inclusive, or earned income as a retirement is not eligible for taxation. So we'll look at that more so on the next slide, but it's good to know that basically half our township is not really in that EIT production window. So in terms of density, I wanted to look at this kind of just the residential component, which is that 56% of the land use, and then the township in a whole. Obviously, the township as a whole is going to have lower densities, but just within our residential, is our residential component even dense in terms of what would be, I would consider to be specific metrics that could be achieved by that. So for the most part, our housing density, based off of all of the units within our residential area, we come out to less than a household per acre. So, we don't, within our 1 acre properties, we don't even have a full household in terms of a metric above it. So that's pretty, that's pretty Spartan. And then when you think about it per square mile, which is a significant coverage of area, it's about 379 houses. So I know one of our communities, I was able to actually like cross section off and do all the measurements. And then it was one of the developments I could actually like count and not kind of count over. So I did a very painstaking kind of numerical evaluation there. It's about 0.7 square miles at Somerset Lake, which is one of the more kind of predominant HOAs. So everyone kind of like think of like, oh, I know New Garden Township, Somerset, I've driven in that lower Landenberg area. It's about 429 type units comparatively to 379. So essentially by this, our township within our residential is less dense than Somerset Lake. So if you're going around and thinking Somerset Lake, this is a very dense community, that phrase has probably never been uttered ever in the history of New Garden Township, at least since that community was developed. And then what that does in terms of residents, how many people are in those houses, obviously, not only are they like not dense, but they're also not very populated. So that means that we probably have a lot of residences that don't have school-age children, they're paying into a significant real estate property tax, and it's not impacting them in terms of, direct kids to school, but it's impacting them and their wallets right time frame. So that's another thing to know, is that a significant part of our population is not being taxed within their own property. And then just in terms of our residential, if we were to take our residential density and then take the entire New Garden Township and expand everything to residential, our total population base would be about 20,000 people total. And so I was joking, I can't remember who on the staff, but I came from a city in Northern Virginia that was about 3 square miles and it had more people. So it's just kind of a different scale in terms of understanding like what 20,000 people means. It's not very dense. And we were considered to be a very green park driven community as well, because we had almost a fifth of our city as park face. I think if I had that number right, but it just gives you kind of a degreeing varied amount of scale there. In terms of housing, it's kind of the same story. So, we have roughly about 0.3 houses in terms of total. So it's going to be a little bit about half, just because residential is about 56%. So these metrics will reflect here. But in terms of when people talk about your township, in terms of your your assessment from larger level housing type entities, they always look at these as their kind of total overall counting type stats. So when they look at us, they go, wow, you guys aren't really dense. You're not all about kind of certain types of initiatives and programs. So I want to make sure that we don't necessarily get caught in a situation where our housing density as constructed kind of takes us out of conversation for future types of grant programs that may or may not become available, because we're just not in that fitting criteria of eligibility, and that can cause some issues. So what I didn't want to exclude in this was those have been gone through some semblance of like a public review in terms of land developments. Obviously, White Clay Point is the one that has, never really gotten any momentum off the ground. But in terms of the Thompson, Bancroft type developments, if you were to include all 3 of these together, it would be about 515 units to that total 3352 total number, and about this many residents. These are on the conservative side. I kind of leaned heavy on the estimates. And that would get our population up to about 13,000, which would get us, based off of 2015's Kennett's Township's comprehensive plan estimate, get us to our population base from what we should have been at 3 years ago. So just to do those developments alone gets us to a number that we're still trying to play catch up. Affordability. So I wanted to include these as kind of the based stats, if you will, for 2021. Obviously, the country has tipped pretty dramatically in the last few years in terms of the housing market. When you have a lot lower of housing, we'll call them inventory, those numbers go even higher. So I know that us as a township, we don't have a necessarily high amount of inventory. So I wanted to get an update on these numbers. So this was where we were at 2021, and this was our distribution chart. And this is kind of where we're at in terms of market rates today per zip code area. Now, some of these zip codes kind of go, almost all of them kind of go outside the township boundaries, but those markets are kind of the markets. So this at least gives you a good understanding of medium home value in terms of the township and medium home value per zip code that would probably be pretty accurate for those houses that are located in New Garden Township. And so what that gets us to is about an average market value of about $528,000. So that's grown. And grown by exactly 19% in terms of average. And that's all of these. If I were just to include the ones at the highest range, because obviously Tough Kenneman, the property values are lower just based off the inventory in those areas, that number would actually be much, much higher. And then with that, our average assessment. So when we go back to if you remember our density numbers in terms of our housing inventory, when you go against your base assessments, your total assessments, that gives you your average assessment per household. So our average based off of the 3,300 total residential units comes out to be about $246,000 per household in the township. So our gap, so the difference between these two values is 281. So our assessment gap is actually higher than our average assessment. So we have, so that creates issues that, because the county controls our assessments and they do it so infrequently, and by infrequently we'll get to every 25 years at a minimum, that creates a sizable real estate property valuation gap that's really tough to continue to mill for increased revenues for services. In terms of home value growth, I'm pretty sure anybody house shopping within the last few years has kind of seen this a little bit, but as of the 2021 numbers, in terms of those values that were above this 300K range, so it's these three bars here and these small two, these were kind of the primary bands I wanted to look at because they're the most prevalent. And so 80% of our township inventory was above that 300,000 level. Comparatively, now over half of all houses are over $500,000 in our township. And that's generally just inclusive of these two. But it's just knowing that what was 300 is now 358, what was 400 is 478, what was 749. And so these are all the corresponding increases based off of that 19.5% increase. Yep. Yep. These are all, yeah, anecdotal evidence in terms of what's happening. You can kind of look at the patterns and in terms of hyper local, yes. Correct. And we'll go into some more stats here in terms of affordability for your actual budget. We're actually just going to go right into here. So the housing income we have right now. So we have a strong housing income in the aggregate, $129,000. Most communities would kill to have that AMI in terms of what is actually, looked at by developers. It's looked at by businesses. They're going to go into markets that have strong incomes. But the issue with us is it's a very skewed income distribution chart. And the big majority of our thing, we have power earners. And then we have, and this is $50,000, whereas from here to here is $50,000. And then here is 200K plus. So it's a very skewed distribution chart here. And so what that does is 30% of all our households earn $20,000 to $200,000 or more. Almost 60% earn 100K or more, but then 25% earn 50K or less. And then 18% basically earn $35,000 or less. And so we have both kind of well represented in terms of it. We have almost as many people that earn 50K or less as we do 200K or more. So our ends of our distribution chart are sizable, leaving only half kind of fluctuating in the middle for the most part. Yep. We have both population presence. And what that does is that means that creates criteria for how you're doing and performing services, because you have to address the whole population base. And everybody has very disparate needs. When you compare very different, we'll call them extenuating circumstances, your daily environment is wholly skewed based off of which level that you are at. So in terms of affordability, so we go back to taking that $425,000 and putting it at 508. So right now, just in terms of just where the macro economy housing industry is, factoring in our local property tax, we'll go into more what local property tax actually means here. We've been kind of stuck around 7% in interest for the first 6 months here. It's going to hopefully maybe come down, maybe rise. I have no idea. I'm not a magician, so I'm not going to forecast what market rate mortgage rates are. But this is also one where this is also factoring in a 20% 100K down payment, which I put it in here because that's the market average, but I don't know a lot of people that have 100K of liquid funding or liquid cash to put on a down payment for a $500,000 house. But nonetheless, I put it in there. And then what that gets you is about a $3,900 a month payment, which means your AMI needs to be about 140,000 gross in order to achieve that 30%, which is that 30% of your gross income needs to be in your mortgage. And so right now that's a little bit over half of our township earns 140K or more, or excuse me, 140K or less. I'm sorry. I wanted to show how much to the left of it. Yeah. 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 And that would make sense because you're pulling in a lot of those other zip codes into their macro view. So the good news is we have, not good news, but like the enlightening information is we have representation from both outcomes. So we are very much a melting pot of probably what the kind of consolidated component is. I wanted to look at what the lowest end in terms of that 300 to 350, which is now 358. This is about roughly 15% of homes. So what that means is at 358, which is what it is today, that's about a $2,300 per month mortgage. And that's about 85,000 AMI to get that same 30, which that's about 36% of people earn 85K or less. So the issue here, and this is what thing is, this is where the biggest gap comes in, missing housing for people that make 85K or less, because you have 36% trying to get the same pot of 15%. So that's a 20% gap there. And that's causes supply and demand. So those actual homes based off of market will probably increase based off of just people wanting to get their chunk before it goes out. No. The ones that are on market for the longest right now are the ones right around that 800 plus. I've been tracking real estate just because I was updating this information. But yes, you're right. The ones that are 400 below go like, and that's even in the current lending environment, and they're going that fast. Well, the one issue is if these are your same people that are also in your 55 plus kind of age demographic, which is sizable percent of our thing, these people are going to be tipping into retirement. So this is not a long-term solvent outcome for us if that is the case. And so it's one we need to make sure that while we cannot control people's inevitable age increases, we need to control, at least to a certain degree, of how we're growing our commercial revenues, most notably the job kind of economic kind of producing ones as well. That's how you combat that type of risk. So speaking of revenues, so in terms of our general fund, I wanted to look at our primary revenues. These are the ones that you make these are your bread and butter revenues. These are the ones that you make your position of in terms of how you're spending on your primary revenues. And for the most part, that's our Act 511, which is our highest revenue producing, which is EIT, on your real estate tax. I also included in this one transfer tax because it is somewhat of a sizable revenue, and it's tied towards kind of the economic type of engine that's happening. And then local services tax, which has a lot of its own flaws because it's kind of a dated numerical value that a lot of townships are combating right now, but it's still one that produces like a very consistent revenue stream. But for the most part, the four primary revenues that I just talked about encompass about 71% of our entire general fund revenue. So this is like in terms of strategy in the general fund, these are it. Because everything else is mostly miscellaneous. It's a lot of, like fines, permits, fees, whatever you name it. And they all kind of add up in the aggregate to make up that last 30%. But there's another part of that that makes up a big component of that 30%, and we'll talk about it. And that is our own cash. So right now, in terms of leading revenues, EIT, then real estate, and our cash is right there in third place. So we use our own cash from our own fund accounts to fund operations, and that is coming from, non-replenishable sources. That is use it and then lose it type money coming out. So the structured use of cash, like I just said, it's about $1.1 million. We'll go into some of the other revenues, and I have some charts here to show kind of everything. But like I said, that's non-replenishable. So here's the breakdown without the cash and the remaining fines and fees. So for the most part, our Act 511, which are these three rolled up taxes here, you can see kind of the distributions here. The total here is 3.5 million. And then our real estate, which we begin to break it out in terms of like apples to apples comparison in terms of our fire expenses and some of the other ambulatory type expenses. So it's good to kind of show, like, for the most part, because your public safety services encumber so much of your general fund expenditures, you want to say that, okay, we're going to bucket this much funding to make sure that we have a remainable balance post public safety expenditures from these primary revenue sources. So you want to align them as much as possible. And then you take your kind of operational, we'll call them like ones that are yielding some sort of revenue recovery. So permits, fines, fees, inspections, you name it, to fund as much as possible of those individual departments to the maximum extent possible. But you know that you're going to have to compensate with some general fund cash as well from your primary revenue streams. But all in all, that gets us to about $4.9 million. Oh, well, we're going to show increases over time and show some metrics in terms of their growth and also what their future outlook could look like based off of those increases, just because of the environment that it means to be a fire department in 2023. But adding all of our revenues together, you can see the additional component. So our cash is about 16%, and then those miscellaneous revenues cover about an additional 13 to get us to 100. So our total revenue position is 7 million, but you can see a big part of that is our own cash. And so what that actually means, we'll go into it a little bit, but when you're using your cash, that means you have the luxury of cash, but that means you also have a structurally imbalanced budget. You don't have revenues to cover your expenditures, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So this is our overall growth in, we'll call it growth in millage rate because it only grew by 0.1, but our actual growth in assessments over time. And so we've had corresponding community growth, slightly kind of small developments here and there, but the difference between 2014 to 23, we got about $17 million in total assessments, but based off of our millage rate being so low, that in total growth is about $110,000 in 10 years. So it's about 10 grand a year. So that can get easily usurped with annual increases in terms of CPI index, inflation, everything. So that actually gets consumed pretty quickly.
And the entirety of that millage rate increase was a voter referendum for the library tax?
This is what, yeah, in terms of what the actual index, this
General fund had a flat.
This gets about that $80,000 per year for that referendum to put into our general fund, operational fund, in terms of providing to the library. But the big thing here was just, oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm just saying, it's real important to note, like, during those years, roads were barely funded for improvement. So
Yeah.
we're kind of, the can has been kicked down the road.
Yeah, I didn't get into the
Sorry.
capital. No, I didn't get into the capital fund expenditures in terms of what we did.
Very disrepaired road.
The difference there, you said.
And actually you have to go down to, I think, when did we go from 0.75 to 1.62? It was like in the late 2000s. 2012. So we had about 2 more years here of continuing to be at 1.62. So we've been over a decade of pretty much flat. Yeah. But the biggest takeaway,
because of the police, the 24-hour police. Yeah.
The biggest takeaway here is that if you are not growing because Chester County does not improve assessments, it doesn't reassess, you have relatively flat tax base because it doesn't really grow at the rate in terms of, because you're not updating that. And that for us, based off our mill rate, is always going to be very low growth in revenue. Yeah, that gets into pretty much a Pandora's box in terms of year over year, but when's our next appeals kind of closure in terms of just? Yeah, there's a couple ways that it kind of fluctuates, but in the aggregate, it's like if you're not growing residentials, then you're more, or your commercial, you're not adding to it, you're typically flattening out. And then if you have, like we have an open space program, you have robust like abatements happening on it, it actually pulls back on it as well. So you can actually stay the same, but then net decrease just by staying the same, just by the nature of that type of stuff happening in your township. So we have pretty static in terms of growth. You know, we have 2 developments, sizable developments, I mean, sizable 130 total units in the last 10 years. One of which is a 55 and up community in terms of age restricted housing. And so it's not necessarily something that has gone in terms of, we grew in a way that enabled us to, like I said, have any sort of like revenue replenishment for increased cost for service. And also, I think I just mentioned it, but if you also have sizable open space programs, you're actually eating into that growth. So if we didn't have this, in theory, this number could be even more. But that's also, like I said, that's a priority, that's fine. But if your priority is in open space, you need to have a offsetting also priority in other types of growth happening at the same time. So another one I wanted to address here is obviously the disparate kind of tax assessments in terms of tax rates. So we're only 1/3 of it. And it's not even really fair to say 1/3, we're like 5% of the equation. But for the most part, you are being taxed as a New Garden resident by Kennett Consolidated School District for your base personal property tax, even your income tax, but most notably your personal property tax. So what that means is if there was any understanding that we wanted to keep tax rates low, that didn't matter because schools grew anyway. And what their millage rates is based off of our base assessments in our township, we grew by 110, like you saw on the last slide, they grew by 4.5 million. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Correct. But what I wanted to kind of point out here was kind of the ratio of us to schools. And right now they're 18.9% ratio between our millage rate and their millage rate. So that's kind of where a lot of it's coming from. And I think this does include, because these are technically, if you look at year, these are fiscal years for us, but technically this is the 22-23 year for them. So the 2023-4 year, this is actually 32.7, or I think they approved. I can't remember what the most updated number was. So this is actually a higher number. So that was me. I think that was provided in June and I just didn't incorporate it into the table, but that number is actually higher. So they're a year off in this chart, at least. $4.5 million is not the, oh, yes, it is. No. It's just from our base assessments. Correct. Yeah, everything is based off of this total assessment chart and these are ours. So their total assessable value of properties is like 2 point something billion. And of which we are just a component of that. So it's inclusive of all of Kennett Township, a sliver of East Marlboro, and then obviously the borough. Yep. And that comes into this chart right here. So these are all kind of the factors that go into it. So they listed out here, this is actually from the Kennett Consolidated. I think it's their annual financial report from 2021 in terms of their military. It didn't have 22-23 in it because they haven't performed that annual financial report yet, but at least can show you kind of the whole distribution as well. And that's where I got a lot of these numbers is, and then as well as the Chester County Consortium in terms of making sure for accuracy. But this is what it means in terms of your tax footprint. So if you take our average assessment, this is the distribution for that. So for us, we are 4% shareholders. So we are a 420 annual tax to the resident, and schools are 8,000 on an average household assessment of $250,000. So I know we usually do in terms of your dollar, you split the dollar, it's like that much to schools, I think, but it puts in the scale of the dollar. I wanted to show it in terms of total dollars here. So, that's showing just the skewedness of where your personal property taxes are going for New Garden residents. And the answer to that is, for the most part, not to the township. Yes. It would, but we would also right size our millage rate. So we would go from like a 1.72 down to like a 0.05 or something like that, because we'd have a much stronger base, if that makes sense. So the millage rate is kind of all in the same. It's really just what you need to fund services. So it's all kind of relative per se, but you're right. Yes, in theory, it would double kind of overnight. Sure. Yep. So I used their 2020, and that's right, it was 32.68 from their budget. So this would get them about $27 million. I think they're all in real estate is about almost 60 million in total revenue. Right around there, I'd have to pull the number out of that, but that's what they get from all the jurisdictions in terms of total property tax revenue, and ours is 1.4. So, what that means is that ratio further kind of skews in terms of what we get and what they get in terms of our real estate millage percentages. And then I wanted to point out that like right now they mill, this number is higher as of 2023, but they get about 3.9 mils just for their debt service. So their debt service millage rate is actually double our township total millage rate. So just for their debt service, for capital improvements, whatever they put into that debt roll up is double what we use for our entire, which equates to about $3.24 million. So more than double, I'm sorry. EIT is another one where we're kind of succumbing to passive level macro and micro regional economic forces. So job market, wages, how the economy is going, that kind of sets the pace for EIT. So the real strategy is you can't control this. So the goal is to just get as much of it as you can in terms of individual jobs located in your township. And so just based off of the growth of our EIT over the course of the last 5 fiscal years, obviously 23 being a budget, not actual, that kind of lagged what our actual expenditures were. So the one thing, because we talked about real estate growth, is not really a growth revenue stream. So if this is a growth revenue stream, it's actually growing slower than our expenditures from 2019 to 2023. And this is something that we, in our, I would consider to be pretty smaller scale budget here, we're still having to adjust for inflation, for costs, for services, for everything. Commodities and consumables cost more. Job wages are going up because of where you're living in your market really dictates what the kind of demand for certain skilled personnel. So you're competing for resources from a human capital standpoint as well. And that's one in Chester County where that's for local government industry, it's definitely going up. I imagine it's all industries, but definitely in ours, we're no different than any other organization. And so those will likely increase as well. So the primary method to affect EIT, I think I just mentioned it, which is commercial growth, brings in higher employee counts in the township as well as residential growth. But there is an element to residential growth, which is we have a 50-50 split on our EIT in terms of township versus KCSD revenue. So for residents, your earned income is actually split 50-50 from township and schools. And so what that means is if you look at what they had projected in their 23-24 budget at about $5.5 million, it doesn't say by township, it's just in the aggregate. So due to some funny math I did here, was able to kind of get in a somewhat of a precise number. I included estimate over here, but this is kind of their EIT revenue distribution chart based off percentage scale of each township that's included in their school district. So we're one of the largest ones, and that makes sense because we have the most people for the most part. But think about $2.3 million, that's going directly towards the school from roughly our 50-50 type split. And so what that means is they have an all-in revenue stream of $98.5 million. Their 2.3 is about 2.3% of their total revenue. For us, and a $7 million budget, 2.3 would represent 38.87. So it's one where means a lot to us, probably a little bit less to them, but that's based off of this rule. And that's an opt-in for schools. They can elect to eat into that tax. It's not something where we could necessarily pull it away. It was just the way that that tax was set up and then schools opting into it as well. And then the immediate transfer of that, if in theory we're able to kind of repatriate that, it would represent about a 2.8 millage increase and about a 24% lift in total revenue to the township. So that would be critical for us, like I said, based off of the scale of operations that we're funding here. So benchmarking, when I mentioned I tried to find some townships that were close as possible. I didn't want to go too all over the chart, so I kind of pared it down to Chester County because they would be roughly in the same market conditions as our township. And this is what I was able to kind of pull together. So these are the ones that kind of fit the description the most. And so obviously square mileage, there is a little bit of a distribution, but between that population and housing units, that kind of all in Venn diagram, these were the ones that made the most amount of sense to compare against. And so with that, I wanted to look at what our real estate taxes in terms of millage rates for each of them. And currently in terms of real estate revenue, we're kind of towards the middle to just below the middle. And so for me, the biggest thing was not necessarily where we stacked, but it's like, why are their millage rates so low? And obviously you look at the names associated with those, and there's a pretty easy reason why. And that's because they have the highest in EIT, and it's not even close. So you're able to afford low municipal millage if you have a massive commercial footprint. And that's something that I don't know if that was ever expanded upon in terms of how we should be growing, but sizable commercial, dense and fitting commercial would be a net relief on our current real estate property millage rates. So another one was just, okay, if we had to put all of our revenues together, where do we end up? Our primary revenues for all of these benchmarks, and we are last. And so that is one where it's not even really that close. We're kind of a sizable degree on the lowest rung there in terms of all 10 of these townships. And so that's one where, we really have to understand how we want to improve upon that here for, like I said, the next 5, 10, 15 years in terms of what we need to adjust our strategy towards. And that's part of some of the well, it's the acceptance that you are shifting. Yeah, and we'll talk about you'll no. Yep. No. And we'll talk about some of those strategies as well here, but in terms of expenditures, I think I probably harped on it enough right now, but your primary ones drive your strategy. This is your footprint in terms of the majority. So you want to set your understanding of where your expenditures are by the biggest one. It's kind of like the federal budget. You have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and defense, and then you have 10,000 other line items in the federal budget. That's kind of where we are. The majority kind of rule up here, and then everything else is kind of broken down by functional service type here. So what that does is it gives us a nice little pie chart. I like pie charts. So this is our big number in the middle. And then, this is kind of where we have a lot of functions, but not a lot of ability to stretch the budget per se. The expenditure is kind of expenditure for the most part. These are mostly salaries or wages and benefits. So it's not just salaries, it's salaries plus benefits plus your kind of contracted services as well as some kind of underlying expenditures. So the big takeaway here is there's not a lot of room for error in a lot of these functional areas. And it's not saying that there are room for error, but these are just bigger departments. So they're going to command more attention and they have differentiation in terms of cost for service as well. But it's good to know kind of where the pie really shakes out. So the recommendation really should always be affect your biggest issue, which is for the most part, our public safety services. And then what that means for us, which is some descriptive notes here, what's included in a lot of these line items, but
I just wanted to add really quickly that over in Kennett Township with their police force, one of their new supervisors that went on, looked into what it would cost to, if they actually wound down their police force, it would cost just as much because of you have all the legacy costs and everything to continue to provide that service.
Yep.
So you can't even the largest things, you just can't.
Oh yeah, no, it's not something you can wave a wand and get rid of overnight. So in terms of the last 5 years of historical expenditures, you can see that there was a bump. I think I lost my laser pointer here, but that's okay. But there was a reason for that jump. And for the most part, actually, I want to kind of go through. So historically, we kind of had a practice of not only having like an over budget kind of under expend kind of culture here, and then we compiled that with accrual based budgeting. So we mixed accounting with budgeting principles. And so that's not necessarily bad, but it just extends your timeline to understand your net impacts because everything is reconciled post year end. And so a cash-based budget allows you to give you enough understanding of this is the remaining amount until I get to end of year and I could project accordingly. Accrual basis, you've already done your budget process, then you come out and then you see your impact. So it doesn't get you in front of the curve, it gets you very much behind it. And that was kind of the thing. And so we had this kind of like back and forth kind of accordion of how we did budgeting. And then that kind of worked for us because, we had a pretty small footprint here in Town Hall in terms of personnel people to really go into the analysis, and it was working. So, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But the last few years with some of these increases, and these were required increases, we had a sizable gap in terms of our fire and EMS expenditures and the rising costs for public safety service, as well as our police. And then I included public works because that's our largest department. And we had to do not only some additions for laborers because we needed the extra people, the bodies. We were actually at a pretty significant shortage, but then also the market rate for their cost per hour as well, because we were even below $20 in terms of labor, which pegged us at like one of the lowest in Chester County, I think, for the most part, if not the lowest. So just that small contribution increase in terms of per hour to our laborers, street crew, which I think is what is that 23 now and change, $23 an hour, which is still not the highest. It's probably still kind of like middle low. Those increases that built that $1 million gap, and that $1 million gap is kind of where we sit, and our structural deficit was about 1.1. So these are, when people ask why those increases, this is kind of why. And for the most part, they're all tied to payroll. And so what that means is, you know, we can't walk this back, you know, and not only that, there's no margin. There's no way to like come in under on a contract or, you know, liquefy some of our deals that we have. Like, this is the cost of doing business based off of, this is the personnel requirement to do business. So yes, in terms of the budget amendment, kind of where we are right now, we have a glide path to use about $1.1 million of our structural cash this year, as it was put into the budget from this year, mostly because we have hard payroll type expenses against it. So that means we have a structural deficit in our budget, if you will. In terms of general fund expenditures, second class townships, you kind of, Chairman kind of expounded upon it, but public safety is an earmark, which means this is what we have to really fund. So this is something that you just can't get rid of overnight. Of which, obviously, for our Southern Chester County Regional Police, for those that don't know, we are an 80-20 distribution between us and our regional partner, West Grove Borough. And then for Avondale Fire Company, we have pretty much an 80-80. It's kind of really around there, but in terms of municipal donations. So we are the primary municipal contributor towards fire and EMS services. And they obviously have different requirements, as you can see from an expenditure standpoint, but over the course of the last few years, requirements for increases were kind of outlined by some of the restrictions that they have, which for the most part, weak EMS billing for ambulatory type services. Their primary revenue engine is their EMS billing, and they're getting less and less and less of it. So that just only means you have to contribute more and more and more. And if we're 80% of that, we're only going to be contributing more and more and more. And then another one is, no, they're responding. Yeah. When there is a 911 call, this is them responding to it. Correct. Yep. No, this is by no means, this is just explaining how everything increased. Another one was, we have, you know, a pending and current and ever ebbing shortage of firefighter personnel. It's tough to recruit volunteer firefighters. And it's only going to be one where that net increase in wages to incentivize them to work on, you know, what I consider to be a pretty tough job is only going to increase. And then capital replacement increase cost too is fire apparatus. And this is just for fire, but same can be said for police as well. Costs for equipment and apparatus, those are only going up as well. And that's not just because the prices of those, but it's the competition for those resources as well. You only have so many manufacturers, so many people getting, but you have thousands and thousands and thousands of townships, counties, cities, towns, all competing for the same pool of assets. That's only going to increase. So I wanted to include up there was based off of our prior year, 5-year glide path to what would 28 projected. I mean, you could see where we're going to be about 1.1 million all in just for fire and EMS services. And that's likely an outcome based off of everything here to the left. So what I wanted to do was align, when you talk about those primary revenues, how much are your primary expenditures eating up your primary revenues? So for the most part, you know, that is about 66%, about $3.3 million. If you add public works, because I think of them as an extension of public safety, they're doing a lot of response. That kind of eats into it even more. So it's about 4.4. So about 90% of our primary revenues are between fire, EMS, and public works. And that's not inclusive of that 28 projection. If we stay flat, which that's how we are, we will be flat if we don't do anything over the course of the next few years. That $533,000 margin kind of shrinks down to like a little less than 100,000. So when everyone always asks me what our cash position is in terms of expenditures and how we've been spending, I had to include everything on here. So this is why this big chart is here, but this is for the most part, pre-sewer sale cash distribution chart. So this is how much money we had from 2018 to about 2021. And so I wanted to highlight here because obviously we have everything highlighted in yellow no longer exists. It is a now since closed, decommissioned fund account that we had. And when I mean fund account, I mean cash account that we had for certain fund operations. So for the most part, I kind of highlighted the ones that are the big takeaways, because as you can see, a lot of these were blocked up into like small money market type funds, like kind of like petty cash on hand, if you will. And most of it was used towards capital. For the most part, though, we kind of had a asset-backed fund from sewer functions that we kind of consolidated and then completely liquidated, and then took a sizable portion of that, about $600,000 plus remaining from sewer, and then everything else kind of went out into general fund and capital fund accordingly. And then the sewer proceeds came in, and then we took that and kind of built that sewer investment income account as well. So what you're really seeing here is kind of the glide path of consolidation meets kind of where it went from expansion. So capital fund there at the top. Can't really see all the way to the right here or left. So this is it. But I wanted to kind of note was I think of total liquid cash. I think of your primary fund. So it's your general fund, your capital fund, and your capital reserve. Those are the ones you want to use towards if there's something going on, I need to do that in the year that I'm using it. That is my primary resources. So those are the ones I'm trying to build back up with replenishable kind of transfers to from my annual general fund revenues. So in 2018, that balance was only about $1.2 million. So we had everything kind of locked up into these smaller maturities, but those types of cash on hand, and we didn't have necessarily a sizable fund liquid cash balance available for everything. We had 13 million, but it was distributed across all of these encumbered accounts, if you will. And I like to think of encumbered because you can't move that cash quickly. And some of it's earmarked based off of where it was sourced from. And you can kind of see the lifespan on that as well. So where are we at today? This was kind of somewhat brief when we talked about the New Garden Hills project, but for the most part, this kind of tells the story of how we're spending our balances down today. And so with that, you can see at the top there, general fund, because that 2021 balance was the same as the one on the previous chart. So that's where we're starting from, but sans all of those consolidated and now decommissioned accounts. We started with 3.8 and we're projected to be down to 2.5. So with that $1 million structural imbalance, we are about 2 years from using all of our general fund funding account back on that one, just year over year churning of operational expenditures. Kind of the same thing for capital. The 5.2, we're down to 3.3. So that's about a 60% drawdown there. So we're about another based off of our capital projects. If you're not getting sizable grant funding, which that's not a really strong strategy because no one gives you tens of millions of dollars to do your own capital work. That's on you. That's why you have to have a facilities and replacement plan. We're down to 60%. Then reserve, we did bump it up from like 180 to about 243,000. So we have somewhat of a built up balance, but in terms of the net position, it's not a significant factor into it. So what that means in terms of our net liquid cash here, we're about 9 million prior and we're down to 6.3 projected. And that's split between those two primary funds. And it's only going in the wrong direction. Yeah. Yeah, a good amount of it was used towards capital. It wasn't really built on building up the general fund because the general fund's been pretty flat for a good amount of time. Yeah.
Yeah, because the developer will come in, build you the roads for free, and then you got to take care of, you got to build all new roads every 20, 30 years.
From
Yeah.
a big number, 2/3 of it is still locked up in the sewer sale investment. So we talked about in the later slide here what that means, but just from a public's perception, 2/3 of our fund account from the sewer sale proceeds, which makes up a sizable portion of the total cash. It's earmarked but not earmarked. It's producing about $1 million in interest income because rates are about less than 5.6. That's up from 2021, which is at 0.3. So it's it can be a golden goose or it can give you absolutely nothing. It depends on the macro economy. So having that money is a really good, what I would consider to be a envious position if your goal was just to build up a reserve position. And that's what that does to us overnight. Usually people have to bucket transfers to their reserves from their revenues. So it's like your expenditures have to be actually like 10% less than your revenues. And you take transfers to capital, transfer to reserve, transfer to special reserve, and based off all your reserve account. And that's how you kind of have a more solvent position. I'm saying that because we have $22 million and it's giving us extra cash, we don't have to incorporate that for now into our general fund expenditures. And that's a good thing. And that's what we should be trying to continue forward here, as much as that number is producing 5%, which I got my fingers crossed here, but I can't control that. So moving on in terms of how we structure our expenditures, you always want to connect them to characteristics. So I'll bring this lovely thing out because I took a 30 minutes of my time to put this together. So I want to be very proud of it. But what does that mean? So safe, that's your police, your fire, your public works, everything. So that's our community characteristic. We are funding that position. Agricultural, agro-industrial, suburban, rural, historic, that's your community development, your safety function. That's your land use, your planning, your zoning, your building permits, your code enforcement, your fire marshal function. These are the people out there making sure that your land use is in compliance with your code and making sure that there's not, as much as humanly possible, as less tensions between those uses as possible as well, which is not a very easy thing to do. And it requires a significant amount of subject matter expertise to understand all the ins and outs from a legal framework. Because that also can build your risk in terms of litigation and everything else like that if it's done incorrectly. Natural, scenic, family-oriented, and active. You know, these are your parks, your amenities, your open space, your airport type program. These are the things that make us like a fun community to live in. So these are very important if you want to attract families and kind of have that growth, younger audience coming in and kind of start from square one and move forward. And then of course, what's not included in this, but it's very near and dear to my heart, is those administrative ones. These are the guys in the back room. This is their central nervous system. So from my, purview, I want to make sure that we're always in a strong position from an organizational health. Financial management is extremely important. Communication in terms of how we are connecting to our residents and getting the message and information out there. And then compliance as well from our legal and engineering standpoint. So this is one that you're not necessarily going to put on a banner out front, but it's one that's very, very, very important. And of course, what guides all this, as said, at some point, getting that vision and mission statement put forward. How are we doing all of this? And what does that mean to be a New Garden resident? So in terms of organizational health, this will be kind of me just kind of quickly going over, but for me, it's making sure that we are at the right capacity to achieve functional excellence. We want to make sure that we are always making sure that we are sustainable, we're cost effective, we have strong customer services that are in alignment with the values of our township, and then making recommendations to the board to approve accordingly within our means. So what that means in terms of staffing capacity, we're resilient, we're well-funded and solvent as well, because you want to make sure that you have a sustainable engine to keep the expectation of we have subject matter experts in the office that can always address issues that pop up, which are constant and varied. So tenets of staffing for me, just human capital is the #1 resource you're going to have in any organization. We are no different because people make stuff happen. Tenet number 2, the most significant investment. So if you don't have human capital and you need something to get done, this should be your primary investment, is to increase human capital to get stuff done. And then number 3, just make those people, when they are in, your priority. You're not saying that we're going to turn this place into a Club Med. I would hardly compare this place to something like that, but you want to make sure that it's a good place to work, a strong workplace environment. So it means that your incentives are strong and your equipment is good to go. Kind of think of it like material condition of what you're working with every single day. No one wants to come in and fight the system that they work on every single day and continue to do work. So in terms of a health assessment, when I got here, like I said, I put on my organizational culture hat. And, for the most part, we're understaffed, kind of underpaid. And that means that from a market standpoint, it wasn't just public or staffing input, but from our Chester County Consortium inputs, 5 of our 6 departments were roughly lower to significantly lower in terms of market competitive rates for their salaries. Certain part-time positions we had were on a stipend basis. They weren't even part-time fully compensated for their work. And then what that led to was gaps in efficiency. We weren't fully addressing everything that we needed to address. And I think anybody who came in anytime over the course of the last 10 years. Probably saw a pretty Spartan group and audience here in town hall, and a pretty significant time lag and turnaround to get stuff completed. We had very legacy type technology that can impact both the front end and the back end. We were kind of like keeping afloat. We just wanted to kind of sustain what we were doing because obviously talked about that was keeping the millage rate low, and that's kind of what the priority was. But that kind of depressed the ability to monitorize, to cross-train, because you wanted to have multiple staffers. If you don't have staff, you don't have anybody to cross-train to do additional kind of cross work. Due diligence, that's a big part of what we do here from a staff perspective. We take information, I'll call it, we take like the 5% solution back and we turn it into 100% understanding of the issue. And that's how we can kind of get things kind of put in terms of a recommendation to the board. And then just reduce capacity for doing kind of what I said, kind of everything, the timelines, being able to deliver information, give you stronger reports, because that's what you need to make decisions. So all of this equated to high turnover. I'll use one thing, but our prior codes position, you know, they went absent as of September last year. It took us 9 months to find a new body. And that's 9 months of stagnant permits, stagnant development in terms of how we're turning around projects, loss of institutional knowledge. And that's actually been a pretty high turnover position in the township for the lowest, at least for what I measured last 10 years as well. So you're losing that, you're losing knowledge of all of your codes, you're losing knowledge of all your zoning information. So when someone comes in from a customer service standpoint and says, can I build this? Because they don't know. So the primary takeaways for me was ensure we have competitive compensation, you know, just competitive, you know, like, are we in the right? And hopefully we can take some of these other elements and make it a good work environment. And with that, that kind of like tips the scale in our favor. We want to be resilient, so no single points of failure. My prior organization was in the same wheelboat. We had a lot of highly practicing managers as your know-it-all experts. And what that meant was somebody left, you're just complete loss of organizational knowledge, institutional knowledge, and it's really hard to recover from, especially when it's one of those like really critical type positions. Cross-train, like I said, and then modernizing your equipment. So staffing levels, we had a very small town hall footprint for what I saw backwards, but within those 5 different functional areas, we had 16 people, individually different people occupying 5 billets. And I think some of them were in it for the long haul. So like Lou being around, he was one of those occupied seats. That means within 4 positions, we had 15 different employees, you know, so it's just one of those ones where that's the turnover that we chronically had in our town hall. So you can see kind of the 5 kind of going through across the board. We only really recently started to address some FTE type changes. But you can see kind of what that meant from a FTE versus total overall wages footprint. So we stayed pretty flat for the most part. And people might say that was their value because they wanted to keep costs down. But that beget turnover, that beget, you know, a lot of issues in terms of gaps of knowledge and everything. So it led to, you know, probably not the best organizationally, I'll call it efficient environment to be in. It wasn't a huge lift. Yeah. Correct. More people on hand means more people to commission towards doing things that have sizable ROI back to the township. And it's for a very nominal increase as well. And that's what I wanted to also people understand. These aren't massive spikes in costs here. Public Works was the same one. We had 14 different employees, I think I measured over the course for roughly about 6 to 7 positions for the most part. You know, that grew up to about 9, which is what the required or recommended footprint was. We're at 9. This is from a budget perspective, but it's not from an actual standpoint. So right now we're at 6 still, even at the $23 per hour rate. We still have yet to get 2 people in for the 2 positions that we bookmarked for the beginning of the year. So we're now going in September. It's tough to recruit and get quality folks that have skills and expertise to be able to do this type of work. And that's also knowing that we're actually, I think, forecast to lose an additional person too. So if we don't replace them, we're going to go from where we are with 7 down to 6, and then that's actually 5, I think. So we're going to be pretty nominal critical mins for Public Works. Yeah. So I included airport in as well, but they're a self-encapsulated enterprise fund. But for the most part, it was John and a bunch of like part-time kind of personnel. So that's not included in the full-time count, but their growth has been based off of their ability to grow revenues. It's nice. You grow your revenue source, you can actually grow as an organization. So that's definitely a success story, but that kind of shows like that lift and that increase. So yeah, just in terms of total expenditures, in terms of the budgeted salaries here, what it encapsulates from our general fund. So I've briefed this to the board, at least to give you some information about it in terms of like recommended organizational chart structural changes here. So this is kind of how we are when I first arrived. So this is kind of where we were kind of saying, so this is kind of a good view to kind of show what all of the encompassing areas as well as our public safety. I did include fire because fire is not necessarily something that we have like commissioned stake in. They're a contributed kind of almost nonprofit type entity that provides that service, but we do have that kind of functional administrative communication back and forth, but not operationally. But the red square and cable is your town hall staff, which we had 7.5 FTE total. And that was inclusive of, I didn't include our fire marshal because he was basically advisory only, wasn't really kind of working really at any semblance of a structured hours. Our BIU function is not an FTE. They're an outsourced third party, but they are part of what was our zoning function. Our halftime code enforcement was also our facilities person. The manager, is just kind of distributed across a couple different kind of sub-line functional areas, just enough to be extra annoying. And then the final part there was Southern Chester County Regional Police was started at 15, but they were forecast to go up by 4. So they got to the 19 officers by the end of the year. So I just highlighted those two because that is inclusive of our 6 FTE budget account. It's still at 4 right now, kind of where we're at. So we still have yet to get to that 6. That would have gotten us to the 9 FTE. So we were forecasting the start of FY23 to have 9 public works, but that 6 is actually a 4 right now. And then obviously our sworn officers. So as we kind of change things up a little bit, we had to replace 2 key personnel. So we did. So one of those was the one that we didn't already understand kind of what that would mean in terms of the next iteration of it. So in the moment in time, I wanted to kind of switch that zoning function and create a more kind of community development department and what that would mean in terms of operational kind of oversight of all of our inspections, as well as our land development and our planning function eventually. But what we also added was our code enforcement officer, because we only had a part-time person doing a part-time for code enforcement. So just not enough for a 16 square mile community. So that was a critical function of need because we wanted to make sure that we had more ability to get out there and understand our property maintenance violations and stuff going on in the township in terms of notices of violation. And then we were changed our communications and customer service person. They were on a part-time basis, but they were able to convert to a full-time position. And that was part of the glide path plan. Actually, when we approved our fire code, was actually commissioning our fire marshal to be not just a consultant stipend person, but someone actually out there to perform inspections. Of course, we absorbed the flight school, so we added all of their contract pilots. That was really kind of at no cost. It's actually net revenue to the airport department. And those were kind of the mid-year type changes here. So obviously a little spiel there. And then by year end, we've kind of made a few more different changes. So our goal was to take what our current, I would call them functional township secretary is performing, which is a lot of like permit coordination and kind of doing that as like a gap filler. But that's not like a long-term plan. You want to have someone performing that due diligence of a secretary's type function, township secretary, for what I mean for that. So that's a lot of like legislative type agenda. It's making sure that the office administration is going the way that it needs to go. And then another one was the recommendation for ARPA funding for funding a year for somebody to be a financial analyst / grant coordinator. And that's one where that ROI from positions comes into effect. That's a big one right there because we're able to put someone kind of heavily dedicated towards searching and seeking out grants. And that's not to say that that's a new position. We had someone filling that type of function that left, and we're trying to replace that with someone with, I guess, a little bit more dual-hattedness in terms of finance and grant coordination. So they're not just doing like one specific thing. And then 24 start. We're still not quite there with our development safety because you want to be able to do more, and if you're forecast to grow and you want to try to do that, you're going to need more of an apparatus to help that happen, as well as doing some of those zoning reviews. If your goal is to look back into your codes and figure out what you need to change, you need staff to support that due diligence. So that's another one where an assistant type director type position under community development, and that's starting to also execute that like lack of single point of failure. That's one where that helps build that resiliency, and that's a consider when I'm talking about loss of institutional knowledge. That's one where you want to have a little bit of a bench in there as well. And then obviously trying to dual hat our fire marshal / EMC type function as well. Someone to serve as that emergency management coordinator to further justify having that be a full position. And that's kind of where we sit. Now I have one more slide in here describing what 25 plus, and that would be for talking about management and redundancy, putting some sort of assistant manager type function on there. But I hadn't included this yet on a TBD type basis, because to me, that is a luxury of a growth kind of component to the township. If we were able to grow our revenues and encumber that type of function, then that would be something I would recommend at that time, but not to stretch the tax rate as currently constructed. So these are just more kind of the staffing increases that we did over the course of the last year. So the all-in total number was about 230 total extra, but a lot of that was fluctuation between kind of retirement of personnel, turnover existing personnel. So we had a consultant doing our codes function at the same time that we actually had our new codes person, our community development director in-house. So we had a bit of an overlap. So all of these increases kind of pan out to be kind of the net aggregate of 230. But one thing to take away from this is going into next year, we get, because of that transition, an extra $108,000 back in terms of just if you did an apples to apples comparison. So our starting point is $100,000 less. So really, if we go back into that standard benchmark of the 7,066,000 range, we did all those changes for about $125,000 net. So that's kind of a good story where we were able to add 3.5 FTE in functional, very critical areas for only $125,000. So that was like a really good starting point going into figuring out what else we need. So a staffing capacity standpoint. So it's also to say that you can do this and not have it be ballooning your budget. And these are wages and benefits. And of course, the additional positions, that 222 converts to those two positions combined. Like I said, I did include the assistant one in there. So we're kind of that number shy from having those two positions fully funded. Now, granted, the ARPA one doesn't kick into effect into 25. So we would have a 24 to 25 gap in terms of that one. But it would be a growth chart for accordingly. So if we're going to plan on possibly funding those positions, that is the growth that we would need to grow by. All right, so tying this all together. So our fiscal strategy. So I said we're gonna do a SWOT analysis. We're gonna actually chart out the SWOT here. So strong community core, we have a plan. We're commercially connected. We have strong corridors going through our township. We have an airport. You know, we have things that are considered to be good bones kind of apparatus for us. Weaknesses, relying on larger level forces, controlling our tax base. We have weak commercial revenues overall for what we want to get to in terms of a commercial footprint. Low density in our residential. Our staff turnover prior to this has been almost like capping us at the knees in terms of, you know, you get a little, you take a step forward and take 3 to 4 steps back. And then of course, I put the KCSD EIT revenue share. That's a small component of it, but just probably a better way to phrase that is just that kind of competition for that vacuum space of us, Chester County, and obviously Kennett Consolidated, all competing for the same resource buckets. It just creates a lot of tension in the community. So opportunities would be, let's, you know, start looking at what our points of interest are within our township. So becoming more, I guess, in this case, embedded with the Chester County Economic Development, as well as Southern Chester County Chamber of Commerce, starting to figure out who wants to know more about us, put like the, you know, if they want to grow commercially, the vacancy sign out front for commercial opportunities, and really starting to heavily market the area to find the kind of the filler for those types of spaces within our township. This isn't to say we're going to like go into the residential epicenters and grow a commercial community. It's saying we have commercial corridors with commercial zoning. Let's figure out what can be done with those spaces that produces higher revenue based off of what I would consider to be, some of them are almost vacant at this point in time frame. So we have Tough Cannon Village. So if there is a residential communities kind of primed for being an epicenter of our township, that Main Street type function for functional density, that would be a good opportunity as well. It's right there on the Baltimore Pike corridor. So it's the natural borough connector, if you will. And then just opportunities are always, if the macro lift happens, we're going to be a part of that. So that's always an opportunity. Granted, it's also on the threat side because it actually could get worse, and we're a consumer of that as well. But threats right now was obviously, we talked about our unbalanced budget, and that's one where we are on a quick path relatively towards having to almost not by, so like based off of where we're at right now, we will be almost required to push into increasing tax rates if we're continuing on this current path. Another one is, like I said, the culture of the cost of doing nothing, just kind of continuing, just combating that complacency, if you will. NIMBYism in general, just people who just don't want things to happen in their backyard. Like I said, the competition, if you will. So those are just some of the threats that I saw. So balancing the budget, I know you said you didn't want to talk about tax and millage rates increases, but this is where we have to actually look at the number just to like look at it. So this isn't to say anything other than this is just what the reality is in terms of the number. So structural use of budgeted cash, 1.1 million. In order to just cover that based off of our base assessment at 826,000, it's not to say next year it won't be any different or slightly lower or higher. We have yet to see, but that would require a 1.4 millage increase just to cover that gap. So just based off of our structural deficiency right now, just to close that entire gap is 1.4 mils. So that also doesn't include a lot of these underlying kind of issues as well, which just the natural cost progression from a CPI. So I took that 7 million number and put a 2.5% increase on it. So that's $176,000 and change. We're going to try to continue consolidating our funds because we had way too many different funds across all these different balance accounts. And so the New Garden Hills and the Parks and Recreation Fund were the ones that didn't necessarily have revenues going into it. We just kind of like parked number in there, and I've just been kind of using it. So we estimated at about 200K coming back in, and that would have to be an increase from general fund revenues to solve, to make those operations fully solvent. Another one was just if we want to grow those staff increases, there was another increase there. So your all-in would be a 2.1 millage increase to cover all of that. So the structural budget deficiency and those underlying increases as well, that gets us about 1.7 extra. So that 2.1 mil increase gets us to 3.82, which if you remember from the benchmarking gets us into, I think, just below like Cal Township and Westtown Township, I think it was. They're right around 4 mils. And those were the ones that were kind of like our peer group right there in the middle. So other strategies we can always do. So every single general fund, capital fund, you can kind of, in your fiscal policy, say that we're going to have lower balances there. A do not go below balance threshold there. So it's like you have 100% of that $2.5 million estimated balance towards the end of general fund. You say we're not going to go below 30% in that fund. So that gets us to a floor of 772,000. You say we're just going to invest that. So at 5%, that would get you about $38,000 to $77,000 based off of what we could do in terms of 2 rolling maturities within the same year. People say that's not a lot of money, but that's the cost to cover a full-time position. So that's something that can be done there. Granted, one thing to always look at is it's a variable rate. So you don't want to structure payroll expenses off of variable rate interest income, but it's a good example of what that could possibly, like the value of that. Same thing on the capital side, kind of the similar story. You know, your fleet lease payment, that's something that could eat into that cost as well. So you're funding your entire fleet payment for the next 5 years off of investable interest, just off of that part as well, on top of the interest income that we already have being produced from the large sewer sale balance. So this is where I talked about and beforehand, that's the variable interest rate that we've seen over the course of the last 2.5 years. Primary. Yeah. So as quickly as it climbed up, it could as quickly just plummet as well. So that's kind of telling you, like, the difference between that on a $22 million is 49,000 versus 1.1 million. So it's like that means that you don't want to park that as a structural use of cash from a payroll perspective to fund operations. And that's kind of what I put out there. So I believe you asked for this, but per household, what would that millage rate increase look like? So I kind of went per band of thresholds here. So this one is a $50,000 valued house at 1.72 mils that's currently constructed. That's their current tax distribution there. So just kind of walking it through. So all we're really going to be changing per one. So by 24 for 3.82, it would be 191 versus 86. So your annual increase would go up $105, which equates about $8 a month or $9 a month for a $50,000 assessed valued house. So going 150, just kind of continue to walk through this exercise. Going up to that, it's 300 a year, so $26 a month for a $150,000 valued house. We're kind of in that like 150 to 4 is like the bread and butter of our property assessments, but we do have some on the outer bounds. So this would be a 250. This is the most common one because our average assessment is 246. So that equates to about a $525 total increase annually and a $43 per month increase. And for the most part, this is rolled into people's mortgages. So it would kind of have a little bit of a washing out type effect there. But if it was just a direct cost increase there, that's how it would come into effect. Same thing for 400. It's a little bit higher. Obviously, these are all going to be a little bit higher. And then this is for 600K, similar kind of continual increases, and then 800K. And now we're getting into a very small bucket of properties in our township that really have at that threshold and up. So I kind of stopped it at 800,000. But that's the reality of what a 2.1 mil increase would be in terms of their township increased obligation. So some other things to consider, and we're almost at the end here. So other strategies, regionalization, continuing to wholesale our partnerships for public safety services. It's kind of required for semi-urban, suburban, rural communities in Pennsylvania to regionalize their public safety costs as much as possible because we cannot fund these operations alone. They're just too sizable for what townships are structured to be able to do. And of course, my battery dies at the very end of the brief here.
Like, why is Chris going through all of this work? We have not really been able to see where we need to be because we had no idea what the cost should be for things that we could do.
Yeah, just continuing to kind of finalize out here. So rezoning, not to say like we're just going to go ahead and completely turn over the property map. That would be not recommended actually, but just what sensible structural changes can we make to our zoning map that makes sense? And so you can separate out, because right now we've had a acceptance of agricultural use permitted within residential zoned areas. And that can kind of be a sticking point because you get a lot of kind of common property owner issue, just tensions just by having that. So by bounding them within certain areas, that's not something that you are not allowed. I mean, that is something that there's no law that says you can't do it. And so you can actually develop like an agricultural type district. Then what that would do is you would just then define not only where those areas are, but then those subline types of agricultural type functions, because it's not just one type of agriculture. You can have aquaculture, you can have other kind of R&D type functions within agriculture that roll up to that. So there's a lot of different items in that portfolio beyond just raw production of material from an agricultural standpoint, and ones that actually produce jobs and outcomes and like modern type jobs as an extension of current agriculture. Another one would be just looking at what densities can be accomplished within certain areas, commercial and residential, mixed use, if you will. And then obviously business attraction, marketing, and economic development, funding those strategies. Reassessing the cost benefit of open space. I know that's a highly valued program, but it's one where there is a diminishing return at some point. And I just would want to say this, does it make sense to at least perform the analysis to understand when that tipping point is, or where it was, or where it will be, and then making an understanding that in order to say that there is a diminishing return, and that does come from an analysis of how to unencumber that type of funding, and then take that already consumed tax appetite and putting it towards another type of resource. So it's like kind of reprioritizing the use of existing funding. Because at some point, those properties that we have on book are going to need to have a certain level of maintenance performed. We're going to need to extend trails through there. So, that is something that the act that enables you to have open space limits how much of that money you can use towards it. And that's something that if you're going out and doing all this for the sake of actually improving a trail network through everything, but you can only use 25% of those funds to do it, now you're taxing the general fund to fund open space type-esque functions in your township. And that's one where, hopefully the public would be aware of what's actually being commissioned to support that. And then obviously from a capital standpoint, just making sure that we do invest in capital, sizable projects, those year-over-year ones that are a little bit more complicated, that if they're going to be grant funded, that they're grant funded as a high sizable ROI. How much are we investing versus how much are we getting covered in total cost? So those kind of low yield ones, like less than 30, 25, where you're putting in, hundreds of thousands, almost millions of dollars for a $2 million project. It's like, well, you're funding well over half of it. So it's something it's not necessarily giving you the biggest bang for your buck. Like the Baltimore Pike Newark Road one's probably one of the biggest bang for buck ROI projects that we have in terms of what we would be getting in return from what we spent in engineering design, which was for the most part, fully grant reimbursable as well. So I think that's it. Questions? So hopefully I kind of walked. So hopefully we walked the dog over kind of everything, but from a board perspective, this was the most important, was to get everybody kind of understanding of where we're at. And
hard to explain to people that do hard to explain all of that. Right? When you did that during the site, I really hope that people.
well, we have this on record. We have the brief. We'll be pumping it out on all of our channels here to try to, but if anybody does have questions, hopefully it's now one that we can easily answer. When we do have the dialogue, which probably is forecast to happen this budget cycle, of what are the reasons that we would have to move in this direction. And I think for the biggest part is we don't have a lot of options. And that's one of the big things. When you're out of options, you really only have a fail safe to certain practices. And one of those is real estate tax.
I don't know if it's a question so much as a comment of there's no other way for us to get an earned income tax apart from we're already.
Well, there is, and that is you have to be labeled as fiscally distressed.
Oh, okay.
So you have to have a certain amount of years in terms of banked operating position in the red, and then you go through the state and they say that you could increase its practice through certain kind of more like urban communities that have lower tax bases from a property standpoint. Their bread and butter is their earned income, and that's how they do it. So their percentages are much, much higher. The most famous one to the east of here is Chester, which is that's what they do. So.
Have you quantified what your light's going to be?
Well, that's the thing. So the way we currently have it is their commercial property alone is valued at one thing, but because our millage rate is so low, we don't get a sizable lift in terms of that. So if it's like a $4 million property, which I think that's what, I forgot what it sold for, but yeah, the 0.00172 mils on that is actually a pretty low number, just in terms of the overall tax. But if you had 100 workers earning $100,000, that's about what, $100,000? Yeah. So that's what that would equate to, an extra $100,000, which for one entity is actually a really great number. And the goal is not to have one pure light, it would be to have a bunch of them, clusters. That's kind of why EIT and East Whiteland or West Whiteland, I forgot, one of the Whitelands is so strong, is because they have a lot of that type of footprint. They have kind of the white collar corporate construct there that enables them to have complexes of sizable salary positions to achieve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't hurt. Sure.
So maybe I do have a question. Pretending that we do nothing, we just want to keep New Garden as it is right now, today, the same age demographic, we don't do anything for zoning, housing, commercial, nothing. We keep it as it is today. that did you say it was 2.7? What was the millage increase? I'm sorry,
It was proposed at 2.1.
2.1.
Yeah.
That's just breaking us even.
Correct. That was the nominal lift for that 200.
So like
Yeah,
salaries keep going up, we're still like,
correct.
right,
Yeah.
again, because you're not fixing the funding for the right?
You're not growing.
That would get us to a point where we would rebase to be even. And then the recommended practice after that is we would,
Cost to doing.
yes,
nothing, and it's pretty significant.
yes, it would have to be either a complete slashing of things, which is not a great discussion to be in, or B,
Flashing,
whole departments.
right? Like, I mean, what are you? Right. Right.
Yeah.
See, but yeah, it's one or the other. Like I said, in Pennsylvania, the way to kind of like diversify your revenues, you're very limited to what you can actually get revenue from. So it would have to be a massive, like if you wanted to fund a community development department, fees would skyrocket for building things, which makes you less viable to have that activity. So it's like a disincentive. So you can't just say, I'm gonna take $100 payment, but I need all that money, so I'm gonna make it $1,000 permit. People will not get the permit, but they'll do it anyway. And then we've seen that as well, where people will just say it's not, it's a bigger, it's less of a risk for them to be out of compliance and pay a significant amount, or just do it and be in compliance. So it's always in a state of tension, but in terms of where we're at, in terms of where we're thinking, we are pretty much stretched at the margins to fund everything that we need to fund in terms of things that we have happening in our community. And so that's what I want. If the public gets one thing, it's like we are spending exactly the way we need to be spending right now. And it's still not enough from a revenue standpoint to cover those costs. That's the story. And the way that we have built this sewer sale funding is that, yes, it is a great, we'll call it fail-safe to have, but it is a one-time fail-safe.
So we could make a tough decision and make it, put us in a better situation, or we can do nothing, kick to the can down the road.
Yes.
An exponentially worse situation.
Well, yeah, because then you wouldn't have anything to back it anymore. Because like if you spend it down,
To, saving.
there are communities that do that. There's use cases of other people that grow into a sizable balance, and then they just say that we're going to keep things flat and go to it, but then they're out of money. And then what do you do? And it's, like I said, like 22 million, people would be shocked. It from a capital perspective, and if you build in a big margin in your budget, 22 million can go pretty fast.
Yeah.
Especially when it compounds because your interest proceeds go away if rates go down, and now you're just eating into that margin. So it's not like an overnight thing, but it's at least like a 5 to 7 year thing. Yeah.
Right. This is like a gift that is
Yeah.
a Band-Aid, temporary.
Very swiftly melting ice cube.
Mhm.
The thing that felt with me is interest rates the last great 2009 recession. Well, there.
Is anyone from the public? Oh, thank you.
Yeah. We didn't do anything.
Oh, well,
Chris did everything.
So we will post links on our Facebook, our website, any kind of social media. Basically just export that to Siri and let her kind of make sure everything is kind of posted where it needs to be. But we'll also have this on, like, I'll post this presentation to the website as well, so people can click through. Granted, it doesn't have the commentary. So yeah. Well, yes, it's a blend, but the The issue is the way that development, this is just from my experience in economic development, the way things were done in the early 2000s, the developers have changed what brings them to the table. So, right, as like the big box, or like, let's say the Priet site that was like, I think $600,000 square feet plus of just 100% commercial. In today's kind of construct with the commercial thing, that, would be a fantastic value, but we didn't have any density around it. There was just kind of, it just would have been this like anchor site and kind of in the middle of nowhere. That doesn't get done anymore. People just don't build speculative macro anchor sites in the middle of nothing anymore. So you need to have some form of density. Yeah. Or you build commercial based off of a residential asset back. So that's why mixed use developments are so in vogue right now, is because you can build 50, 100, $150,000 of just blank slate commercial, knowing that you're also developing hundreds of units at price that you're going to make your money back. So you're not going to take that much of a risk on commercial development without knowing that you're going to get your payout. So understanding what brings developers to the table is critical, which why the UD is so important, and looking at our density volume within our UD is important. So we want to make sure that when we go through one of those development processes, we want to look at what brings density in terms of the value add that it would be. Is it enabled within our current zoning? And I think right now there's issues with it, that it's not 100%
Agreed.
accomplishing those density requirements.
You can't recruit the commercial space unless you have a certain density.
Number of people to
Right,
buy stuff.
So you have your primary, your secondary, and your tertiary markets.
So
Yeah.
People complain about, density, possibly looking at like 1 to 20 units per acre.
Yeah.
That's kind of where it needs to be in specific zones, not everywhere. Right. In specific areas where I think it makes sense to recruit the right commercial space, which then in turn reduces the tax
Yeah.
burden.
Then like the issue with White Clay Point, and obviously that's the one that's been around for 20 plus years. It's a very difficult site as well. And that's another one. So the infrastructure improvements in today's lending environment and supply environment, development costs were astronomical, benefit of all the road, hardscape, and stormwater type improvements. So in order to do that and build the amount of commercial that we wanted them to build there and have the residential to make that kind of money back, the math just was probably not working out, which, we don't have managed economic development in Pennsylvania in terms of back and forth between what you can provide incentives for locally versus what you can do in other states. So that's another constraint. I probably should have put that in our weaknesses, but it's one where you can have that conversation. And I think that conversation yielded that, let's say like the post-pandemic fallout made it so that there was definitely going to be a lot of projects kind of on the shelf until things get better. And that's going to be rates, that's going to be supply chains. Good news is I think we're heading towards that type of environment, but that's another fingers crossed type thing. That's my. Yeah.
I do.
What is it? Like a word cloud? Just send out a panel and just whatever you get back, just circle the big ones and that's it. Build a sentence like a Mad Libs. There you go. No.
Yeah,
Oh, thank you.
finance.
Well, now we get to actually budget. Now we actually have to do the work.
Again, part of the problem here is the unfunded mandates that we handed down this morning.
I keep on telling people I didn't even address capital because it's
Sure.
depressing, but yeah.
Unfunded mandates are insurance regulators. Medicare is gonna pay 2 on the ambulance crew to go out and give lifts.
Mhm.
Not less than children's families. And these are what they are getting paid. I mean, they drive from, whether it's 3 miles or if they go 7 miles across the township diagonal, that's what they get paid.
I think the fire and EMS stuff is one of the most important things that we vote on, that
And that's
impacts
been- That's-
lives.
Absolutely.
I mean, right now, the wait time for EMS, and she said 8 minutes at the last meeting or something.
We're an average of 8 minutes less.
Which I just think about my daughter sitting there for 10 minutes, 8 minutes, waiting for somebody to come. And then we're put in a position where we have to make decisions that could cause that to be longer. That's not something I would ever want to do to anyone. Could you come up here and say that into the microphone?
Yeah, 100% of New Garden residents demand their taxes be raised.
No, it's really not. But it's not funny. It's the sad situation.
Yeah.
It's the reality. It's like, years, I think Chris is short shared that. The staffing levels, the wages, I mean, in order to attract good people, Ted asked me what I thought we could get. I wouldn't do it for $30 a month. I wouldn't. Commercial.
If you go, and to answer that question, a little bit, if you go from a regular driver that almost everybody gets to their 60, go to a CDL now, it's almost $6,000. Plus, included in that is 160 hours, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, 4 weeks straight of training that is federally required. So like if one of my guys want to go get their CDL now, I lose that for 4 weeks and it costs $6,000. And if somebody's coming out of high school, they have to pay that as well. So you're not going to find somebody that they can $50,000 that can shell out $6,000 to get a driver's license without driving half of our.
Now, Kenny, I'm not asking this question. I just know somebody will ask this question, right? So what would someone need a CDL license for public works?
Any vehicle over 26,000.
Which means your plows. Do you want your roads plowed?
Pretty much every F550 and up. Okay.
Three of the big free ones.
Maintain the roads, like everything that you pretty much do. Okay.
Pulling the trailer with mini excavator,
Yep.
things like that.
In the middle of the night in the middle of the day when a tornado touches down and all the trees fall down in the middle of the road. By the way, thank you guys for everything you did with that last storm. You were right there. Like, I mean, I don't think public works. Thank you.
What percentage of the agriculture? You came up with 10%, 15%.
In terms of the value differential, it was 10%. A little bit over, it's like 10.7 or 6. Okay, thank you you wrote it down.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just have a number
Just
brain.
Endemic memory. All right,
Things that make me
endemic.
angry, I remember.
Yeah, but yeah, that's not to say, I can imagine that if you were to take and just reclassify it. And that's what I would hope that, because you have to look at it based off of the data that you're given. If they were just to break out commercial and commercial farming versus commercial, like larger level commercial facilities, I would want to see what that true land acreage footprint looks like. But I mean, it's hard to say that. I mean, just look at the entire western side of the township. That is a sizable complex of major facilities. And so when I look at 26% and then I look at just an aerial satellite imagery of the entire township, a lot of that is baked into the mushroom industry, which pulls down that number. I would be more interested in if you were to separate what that non-agricultural mushroom component looked like in terms of above value, the increase in that differential, because it would have to lift up because the other one's pulling it down.
So that puts the average.
Yes.
Well, that's things like that.
Dirt on the road,
Well, the roads.
things like that.
Yeah.
It's agriculture vehicles. Typically goes mushroom,
Mhm.
farm tractors.
Farm exempt.
Heavy.
So it
Yeah.
doesn't smell like money.
Well, it's not locally. I don't know. And it's not to say that there isn't some like benefits of it, but
It doesn't, smells like the opposite.
there's a difference between regional outcomes, state outcomes, and local outcomes. And I would say that we at least have the information that 240-ish thousand total produced in real estate from that kind of cross-section. It's like I said, if you broke it out, it's probably lower just for that component. And the EIT being all in at 2.7, if you were to probably structure that based off of all the households and in residents, you know, it's probably a smaller percentage of that total EIT, especially some of the payroll practices that are done there in terms of contractors. So it very much is a sizable presence, very small, like local level contributor.
According to your chart, that EIT.
Yes. Correct. EIT, like I said, it can vary. So the way that people might be downsizing and orchestrating their positions and their, you know, we right now, I think have from a trying to think of like availability in commercial properties, there's actually been kind of a net growth in available, like those like standalone grow houses, kind of sporadically kind of peppered about in a lot of our residential communities. You know, those are coming available. When I talked about rezoning, that was one where it probably would make sense to kind of bound all of those types of uses and figure out what that means, because right now it's just mushroom farming as a by right within a residential. So if someone were to come in and say, hey, I'm not a mushroom farmer, but I want to use this facility as X, they can't, because it's not allowed within the zoning, because it's not a by right type use. So we would have to go through this massive land development process at probably a significant cost to do so, to figure out a new use for that, which that's what I'm saying. In order to be able to bring people to the table, we as a township want to make it as easy as possible to do business if it makes sense for us to have that type of business in our township. We don't want to be actively pushing people away, not only just from NIMBYism, but also just from the process to get stuff done here.
It's too challenging of a process. to
And it can take a long time for certain things to happen. So that's why I was really happy about the Pure Light outcome, because it happened and everything was performed to a T in terms of due diligence, but we were able to get it within that 90-day window, which was thankful for the staffing levels that we had at the time when that proposition came along.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I will, like I said, include this in all our budget documents. And then on our YouTube space, as we do all of these budget briefings, we're going to have it categorized by like what they were. So all of our budget briefs will be recorded and we'll provide all those links. So I think in the upcoming one towards the end of September, we're going to be doing that. It's a pretty small kind of reorganization we're doing, because it's only a certain types of funds that are impacted in terms of the parks and New Garden Hills Fund. I think there's some fleshing out of, for those enterprise funds, making sure that they have an enterprise general fund and an enterprise capital fund within those. So just kind of some retooling of it. Those will be explained, as well as we're going to try to get all of the capital budget briefed as well. So, and that's a 5-year capital brief for everybody.
Can you email?
This?
Yeah.
Yes. Let me make sure that the size of the file is good. Otherwise, I might have to save it as a PDF so you don't get all my fun animations. So that's nice.
Star Wipes.
Star wipes, all star wipes. Yep. Okay.
Okay.
All right. No, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. We'll close the meeting then. Thanks for coming out. All right. Take
Yeah,
care.
Thanks, Lynn.
See.